Good afternoon, family, friends. Welcome to this edition of the 2021 Virtual Slave Dwelling Project Conference. As always, we are so excited to have you here, excited for the wonderful presenters. I hope all of you have been able to attend previous sessions before this one, and that you have enjoyed them. I'm sure you have. This afternoon, we are going to be treated to a session by Dr. Rhonda Thomas from Clemson University. As a native South Carolinian, I am very interested in hearing this session, which is why I volunteered to host it. So without further ado, you didn't tune in to hear me. My name is Laverta James. I am your host, but that's all I am, is your host. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Thomas now. And I'm sure you're going to really be interested with what she has to share with us. A couple of housekeeping notes. I don't believe that you can unmute yourselves, but if you can, please be sure that you are on mute at all times. And if you have questions for Dr. Thomas, please drop them into the chat. You will not be able to ask her questions directly on this platform, but you may place your questions in the chat, and she will answer your questions either during or after the presentation as she sees fit. Okay, without further ado, we welcome Dr. Rhonda Thomas.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to just introduce myself and the topic I'll be speaking about, and then I will either answer your questions as we're going through the presentation, or there will be a little bit of time at the end. So as it was spoken, I am a professor at the Clemson University in upstate South Carolina, where I teach 18th and 19th century African American literature. I've been at Clemson since 2007. I'll talk a little bit about my journey here during the presentation. The presentation today focuses on two aspects of Black history that I'm currently researching at Clemson. The first is my project, Call My Name, African Americans in Clemson University History. It starts with the antebellum period. Enslaved people labored for John C. Calhoun on the Fort Hill plantation, upon which Clemson was built in 1889. I go from that generation to the current generation, which we label 21st century activism. There are 7 total generations, which I'll talk about today, and kind of think about how pulling Black history into a pretty white public narrative changes the narrative. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is a very recent project that just happened last summer. 667 unmarked graves were recovered in the campus's Woodland Cemetery. I will talk about how that project came to be and how it is related to Black history at Clemson. And when you think about the strands of history that are on that historic site, then how does it change the narrative of Clemson's burial ground, the Woodland Cemetery, that actually dates back to the early 1800s from what we've been able to discover so far. So I'm ready to show my slides and work through my presentation and answer any questions that you all might have about my work. So I want to start with milestones in Clemson history. This is a story that we usually hear. In 1889. South Carolina Governor Richardson accepts the will of Thomas Green Clemson, our founder, for the bequest of the Fort Hill plantation for the establishment of Clemson. Next thing is 1893. Classes begin at Clemson Agricultural College of South Carolina for 446 white male cadets and all white male faculty and administrators. In 1955, this is kind of a big leap. Clemson enrolls white female students and becomes civilian. It started as a military land-grant school. In 1963, Harvey Gantt desegregated Clemson. And then in 1964, Clemson attained university status. Even employees who are coming to the university today, this is basically the standard history that they receive in orientation. One of the things we don't usually tell new employees or even people who are on campus is that before there was a plantation, this land was inhabited by the Eastern Band of the Cherokees. There's a little town here called Seneca that was located on the land. It is now under Lake Hartwell. But I like to begin these presentations with a sort of land acknowledgement that the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians lived on this land, and there are other Native American towns on this land. Seneca was burned down during the American Revolution, and most of its inhabitants killed in that fire. The Hopewell Treaties were signed on a plantation that is now on Clemson land. And most people think that Cherokees left the area, but some stayed behind for quite a while. The university is now seeking to do a better job of documenting and sharing this aspect of the land's history. But I'm going to turn my attention now to Fort Hill. If you've ever been to Clemson, you will see this house sitting in the middle of campus. When I came to Clemson in 2007, I did not know the university was built on a plantation. None of the people who had interviewed me shared that information with me. I learned on my first day at work that Clemson was built on a historic plantation. So that was a startling moment for me. But in times since, it actually sparked the work that I'm doing. So I look at that as the birth of the Call My Name project, which I'm introducing to you today. But John C. Calhoun moved his family to the site in 1826 and eventually established this 1,025-acre plantation. This is Thomas Green Clemson, our founder. What we hear about him initially is that he was a son, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a farmer, a diplomat, a Secretary of State, Secretary of Agriculture, a scientist, and of course, Clemson University founder. What we often don't hear is that he was an overseer, a plantation owner himself. He bought a plantation over in Edgefield, South Carolina. He was an enslaver. He purchased slaves for John C. Calhoun as well as for himself. And he served in the Confederate Army. So what happens when you have this holistic look at Thomas Green Clemson? I'll ask you to think about the same for his wife, Anna. She's described as a wife, a mother, a grandmother, the secretary for her father, John C. Calhoun, before her marriage, and then co-founder of Clemson. But she also was an enslaver, mistress, and a pro-Confederate. She supported her husband and her son as they enlisted in the Confederate Army. So what's missing from this public narrative? And here it is. This is one aspect of that missing story. So I mentioned that first story of enslaved persons. We like to start the story in Africa. There were at least 3 Africans who were enslaved on Fort Hill who were over 100 years old. So it's very possible that they were brought over on slave ships during the 18th century. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, tenant farmers and domestics and sharecroppers worked on Fort Hill. Convicted laborers leased by the trustees from the South Carolina State Penitentiary built Clemson between 1890 and 1915. After the college started, African American wage workers were employed and lived on the campus, and extension agents worked in the Cooperative Extension Services program. In 1920, Black musicians began playing on the campus for social events. And then, of course, that watershed moment in 1963 when Harvey Gantt files a lawsuit and enrolls at the college, ushering in not only the opportunity for students, but also for faculty and staff and administrators to come and work at Clemson. And finally, Generation 7, which we just added about a year ago, has been the generation that has been really engaged in activism. So I want to go through these generations, and then I'll turn to my second story. This first generation, this is a schedule of enslaved persons, 50 of them. The youngest is Katie, 0 years old. The oldest, Phoebe, over here, 100 years old. They labored in the traditional jobs as field hand, carpenter, cooks, valets, drivers, mammies, I call them, because that was actually a term used for one person, Susan, who was an enslaved person for Fort Hill and also for the Clemsons when they moved over to canebrake in Edgefield, South Carolina, and Ladies' Maid. The field slaves on Fort Hill worked down near what is now Lee Hall, and they lived in granite stone quarters. The house slaves, those who worked for the Clemsons and the Calhouns, lived in quarters closer to the main house. If you've been to campus, that is our shoe boxes. So these stones that you are looking at now are the foundation for Hardin Hall, originally the chemistry building. These are actually the stones from the slave quarters that were dismantled by the convicted laborers and moved up the hill and used as foundation stones for some of the buildings. Generation two, the sharecroppers, if you look very closely at the bottom of this document on the right side of your screen, you'll see some names. And each of those names has an X mark between the first name and the last name. We have 4 agreements. They would sign them on the first day of the year, 1867, 68, 71, and 74, to work for Thomas Green Clemson for the year. There were 44 freedmen and women, so we know that they were formerly enslaved, 40 men and 4 women. And there were an additional 16 children listed as half hands or boys. And you can see some of those children here, the half hands and the boys. We don't know their names, but we want to acknowledge the fact that these children, probably formerly enslaved too, also labored on Fort Hill as sharecroppers. Clemson, as I mentioned earlier, was built by a predominantly African-American convict labor force. The trustees leased them from the state penitentiary, which was located in Columbia. Nearly 700 names, 50 pages of names is what was recovered in the state archive. The youngest who was on this list was Simon Davis. He was from Abbeville, South Carolina. When he was processed, they told me, into the penitentiary, the oldest was 67. Over half of these men and boys were under the age of 30. Just 43 of them were white, and most of them were convicted of some form of felonious theft. Often people ask me if they were convicted of loitering, some form of loitering. I said no, they were stealing food or clothes. They would steal cattle, grain, and to help feed and clothe and house their families. These were crimes of desperation during a time when it was really, really difficult to live as an African American in South Carolina, due in large part to the policies enacted by Benjamin Tillman, governor of South Carolina, then South Carolina State, South Carolina Senator, U.S. Senator, but also the orchestrator of the South Carolina State Constitutional Convention 1995 that really encoded Jim Crow laws in South Carolina. Generation 4, these are the African Americans who were employed and worked on campus as cooks, janitors, maids, babysitters, butchers, barbers, farmhands. All these jobs sound very familiar. Jobs that were done by African Americans in the antebellum period, often as slave labor, similar jobs for the campus. They worked on the campus and lived often in houses that did not have indoor plumbing. We're also learning that eventually they were pushed to the edges of campus before, about in 1960, they were forced to leave campus and live in a housing development that Clemson created called Tom Littlejohn Homes that was located off campus. There were also these Negro extension workers, quote unquote. They worked for cooperative extension as agricultural specialists, also kind of home economics specialists. They would go into neighborhoods where people were living at or below the poverty line and help them with their farming, with very simple things they could do to beautify their homes. If you look at this list, you will see that these are not all the counties in South Carolina. So even though the population of African Americans and whites was about the same when this program started, they were not able to send agents to every county. So they were always underfunded and understaffed in trying to meet the needs of the African American community. Generation 5, I know I'm moving quickly, and if you have questions, I'll answer them at the end. These are the musicians that I mentioned who performed. Some of you may know these musicians, recognize them. Our students have not heard of most of them, So we have to introduce them to what I say are the Beyoncés of their time. These are world-renowned musicians that were invited to come and perform at Clemson. I included the photograph of Duke Ellington on the left side of the screen. He came to Clemson in 1955. He played with his orchestra for 3 concerts that weekend. Mr. Ellington could not stay on campus. He actually had to stay at a segregated hotel in Greenville and was chauffeured back and forth during the weekend for those concerts. But by 1962, Ray Charles, the Shirelles, King Curtis, these are other names of musicians that are more familiar to modern audiences. Generation 6, this is that pivotal watershed moment that I mentioned. Harvey Gantt is there in the center of this photograph. Most people focus on 1963, but his journey to Clemson actually starts in 1960 when he requests a bulletin and returns an application card. 1961, he has his application rejected. He reapplies. He's a very persistent young man. 1962, he comes to Clemson and wants to meet with the registrar. They say no. He files a class action lawsuit at that point. December, U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Gantt's favor. Clemson fought this lawsuit all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he registered for classes on January 28th, 1963. That's a very different narrative than simply saying that Clemson enrolled its first African-American student on that date in 1963. It was a long, long journey to that moment. And then finally, Generation 7, this is the 21st century generation of activism. These are just 3 examples of activism. The die-in on the left of your screen after the officers who murdered Mike Brown and Eric Garner were not indicted. Our students staged a die-in in their honor on Bowman Field. At the top of the screen on your right, that is Darian Rencher. He helped to organize a Black Lives Matter march during the pandemic. And at the bottom of your screen, this is one of our most recent initiatives. It's a video series, We See You, where students got together and they talk about some of the issues that do not get aired in public that students of color are experiencing on campus. They wanted to give them a voice and a platform to tell their stories. So our students are very, very involved in activism these days with issues involved on campus as well as throughout the United States and globally. So Call My Name, the project itself, we do a variety of things to help change the narrative on campus. We offer Black Heritage campus tours. I did a preview exhibit that introduced people to the musicians and the convicted labor generations about a year ago. This book on the right side of your screen, Call My Name Clemson, was published last year. It talks about my project, my own story as a South Carolinian, and the university's slow move toward embracing their complete history and a commitment to tell that history. We're also working on a campus tour video, a play, a touring exhibit, and a couple of more books. I have a student advisory board and a Call My Name coalition of community partners. So as you can see, there are multiple ways to change a narrative, and we are trying to get people multiple ways into this narrative so that they can understand the complexity of Clemson University's history. I want to pivot now into the history of Woodland Cemetery. Woodland Cemetery sits next to the stadium on our campus. Come to Clemson or have been to Clemson, think about where Memorial Stadium is. And if you're facing the hill where our young men run down before the games, it would be to your left. It was founded in 1924, but you're about to find out that there's a lot more to this cemetery than meets the eye. So I call it a tale of 2 burial sites. So beginning in the 1800s, African-American enslaved persons, sharecroppers, wage workers, tenant farmers, and convicted laborers were buried in this, we believe were buried in this wooded area. And then in 1837, the other side of that story, 6-month-old John Caldwell Calhoun was buried on the top of the hill. He's the son of Andrew Pickens and Margaret Calhoun, and the grandson of John C. and Florrie Calhoun. Two burial sites. We're going to trace this narrative. So the site for African Americans soon becomes known as the, quote, colored graveyard, end quote. In 1946, Clemson's Buildings and Grounds faculty committee recommended installing a marker for that site where they believed 200 to 250 enslaved persons and convicted laborers were buried. But that recommendation was never acted upon. On the other side, by 1924, at the behest of President Riggs, who came up with the idea for the cemetery for white employees, in 1924, white employees were allowed to be buried in what became known as Woodland Cemetery, after serving, I think, 2 to 3 years of work at Clemson. So what happens is we keep going through time. In 1957, faculty are still and staff are still talking about this, what they call, quote, the colored graveyard, end quote. The director of the physical plant now wants to put a fence around it. They're concerned as the campus is expanding that site won't be protected, but that recommendation was not acted on. However, the same year, there was a recommendation for plots on Cemetery Hill or Woodland Cemetery to continue to be provided for white employees who had worked for the college for more than 3 years. So you can see kind of the expansion of Woodland Cemetery for white employees, but every effort to protect what was thought to be the, quote, colored graveyard, those recommendations were not acted upon. In 1960, something pretty tragic happens. Clemson requested and received a court order from Oconee County to disinter remains from the west side of the cemetery. And if you're facing the cemetery, it's the back side. You kind of go up and over the hill, and reinter them on the south side to facilitate what they said was, quote, orderly and proper development, end quote, of the college. The graves were to be marked and maintained in that new area. The process was begun in 1960, but stopped for unknown reasons, and the graves were not properly marked or maintained. And when they were putting in a parking lot in that area in the 1960s, the remains of at least 3 African-American children were disturbed, and they were reinterred on the south side of the cemetery. However, at this time, white employees were still being allowed to be buried in Woodland Cemetery, even as the area where the graves of African Americans were believed to be located was being desecrated. So we have to fast forward now a little bit more to when African American archaeologist and anthropologist Carol Cohen Ricks was asked to conduct some surveys on the hill, some archaeological surveys and digs. She did. She worked for about 3 years. Her results were inconclusive. She wanted to continue about 3 more years, but they decided to let her go as they downsized that program. What we discovered is that she was digging between and beside recently recovered unmarked graves, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. After she left, right after she left, Clemson began assigning graves on the western slope where that, quote, colored graveyard, end quote, was located in the area that Carol Cohen Ricks had been working in. One more time, in 2002, fencing was installed. This fencing that had been talked about earlier, but it wasn't to protect the area, it was to prevent construction crews from using the site as a dump. Clemson noted both sites, the west side and the south side, as places where unmarked burials for African Americans were believed to be located in a report that was issued by the Stewardship Committee. The other side of this story, between 2003 and 2005, a Stewardship Committee was established. The state archaeologist was brought back multiple times to do a little research on the site. The need for ground penetrating radar was noted, but the site survey results are inconclusive. Despite that inconclusive nature of the study, the area for the plots for Clemson employees was expanded again, and this time it's going down the hill toward the stadium. I put this contrast in signage because these are kind of the contemporary ways these two sites were marked. The site on, you can see the fence. That fence has been taken down recently, but when that fence was up, this one of the signs that was placed on the site where African Americans were believed to be buried. It was called the Site of Unknown Burial, Sierra, 1865, which is an unusual date because it is believed that enslaved people were buried there in addition to the sharecroppers and wage workers and convicted laborers. And this is the sign for Woodland Cemetery that is on one of the gates at the entrance. When a couple of students that I'm going to introduce you to learned about this area, they came and put these flare as a way to honor those that were buried in those graves. So the story gets a little bit more complicated. In 2016, I learned about this, what they were calling the Fort Hill Slave and Convict Cemetery. I worked with Dr. James Bostic, the first African-American to graduate from Clemson with a PhD, on getting a South Carolina historical marker installed. Nothing was said to us about the other burial ground on the west side. All of the attention was focused on that small, about a 1 acre size area on the south side of the cemetery. When we saw that site, it was completely overgrown. You couldn't see anything. They cleaned it up. We were hoping that that would lead to better care and respect for that area. The sign was installed, and I would point visitors to that site when we did our tours, but little did we know what was actually happening on that site. This is me on one of those tours. This young lady here on the far left, Sarah Adams, was one of the ones who initiated the current project that I am about to introduce. So after taking that tour, you can see a better angle of that site of unknown burials. Sarah and her friend Morgan Meloso visited that site. They saw that it was full of trash. The fence was falling down. They were very distressed. They came back to me, and we worked with a group of faculty and staff and students to have the site cleaned and a memorial installed. But on the night before some ground penetrating radar work was to begin, members of our team found that 1960 court order that I just told you about a few minutes ago. And so we decided to survey this site, and this is that west area that I've been talking about, to see how many graves could be recovered. And that first day, 215 unmarked burials were recovered. And you see these little white flags with pink ribbons. Those were sites where those burials were recovered, 215. So we decided to survey the whole hill, Cemetery Hill or Woodland Cemetery. And by the end of January of this year, 2021, 667 unmarked graves were recovered throughout the cemetery. So these are some new temporary markers that have been installed to acknowledge the fact that we believe the site now includes burials of enslaved people, sharecroppers, domestic laborers, and convicted laborers. I like to end the story of the tale of two cemeteries with the story of Judge Crawford. He was a gardener for Clemson. He began working at Clemson in 1890 and worked for the college for 57 years. At the end of his time, he went home to Pendleton, where he stayed for a few years with his wife, had a couple of good years with his wife, and then he died relatively young. His wife came to Clemson and said, "I think you should honor my husband. He gave 57 years to this college. Let's find a way to honor him." They were about to create a test garden for camellias, these beautiful flowers, our ag program, and they wanted to name the test garden the Judge Crawford Camellia Test Garden. Unfortunately, that recommendation from the faculty was not acted upon. The Camellia Test Garden went on to become the South Carolina Botanical Garden that now sits on our campus. There is a camellia section in the South Carolina Botanical Garden. When I visited that garden a few years ago, I could not find any references to Judge Crawford. His widow came back again and said, let's name a street in his honor. The recommendation was for a street in the a housing development that was being created, the Little John housing development. The street leading into that development was supposed to be named for Mr. Crawford, but that did not happen either. And then a strange thing happened after they cleared up the area next to the cemetery as they prepared to survey the entire site. Later that spring, when we were walking around, we found camellias. There are a total of 11 camellia plants that stood the test of time. Nobody was taking care of them and watering them and weeding them, but they continued to grow in that overgrown area, a fitting tribute for Judge Crawford. We are working now with the university to ensure that Mr. Crawford gets his just due and recognition for his contributions to Clemson history. So a little overview of the work that we've done with the cemetery project now. In July of 2020 rather, our board chair appointed a task force and a legacy council to facilitate the work of the African American Burial Ground Project. The ground penetrating radar work began in July of 2020 and was completed. The groundwork was finished in January, and then it took a little bit longer to get the report together. We are hiring academic researchers, community engagement staff, creating a council. We have a community engagement council that we meet with every month. We've begun our historical research and expanded engagement with various communities on and off campus, including descendants and alumni. We have had our community engagement council has focused on engagement with our descendant community. We have been able to talk with families of African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved on the Fort Hill Plantation. Some of them actually lived in and near the cemetery, and we've been able to start documenting their lives there. We have a communication plan, to facilitate this transparency we are trying to ensure with this project. We have a project website, clemson.edu/cemetery, that I encourage you to take a look at. And we have regular public tours of the cemetery now, including the African American Burial Ground. With our engagement initiatives, we have had Zoom forums. We just started in-person forums last Sunday. We are helping family members identify loved ones who have been buried in unmarked graves. We're also starting a genealogy workshop series. Our students are involved with the project. Our civil engineering students are creating pathway ideas to access the cemetery. One of our architecture students came up with a design concept for the memorial. We have a forestry student who is creating what he calls witness trees. These are the oldest trees in the cemetery who were around when nobody else was and have seen it all. And we have a creative inquiry team that began this fall of 15 undergraduate students who are doing research with us. We've reached out to our alumni through forums and interviews. And again, we have public tours on Mondays and Fridays and by request. So if you're ever at Clemson, we encourage you to come by and take a tour. Next Thursday, October 7th, we are holding a public symposium. It will be all day. It's available on Zoom. Just wanted to make you aware of it. We're going to be talking about our work in more detail, but we've also invited professionals and faculty from organizations and universities across the country to come and talk with us about archaeology methods and analysis, about multiple stakeholders. How do you engage with multiple stakeholders on campus and in the community? We're going to have an introductory tour of the cemetery that we'll show during lunchtime. We'll talk about archival research practices, and we'll talk about known and unknown burials. How do you tell stories? How do you memorialize individuals who you know as well as don't know where their graves are and who's buried in those graves, rather. We'll talk about that. We'll have panels throughout the day and then some facilitated conversations in the early evening. And we encourage you to register for the symposium on our website, the clemson.edu/cemetery. So here's information about the project, the website address again, phone number, email address. This project is ongoing. We feel like we've just gotten started, but we definitely know a lot more than we did when we initially started long ago. So we have a little time. I'm happy to answer your questions. There is a question about um, the slave quarters. So yeah, very interesting story. So those Fort Hill slave quarters, a little bit about them. They were shaped like a rectangle, made out of granite stone. They were located near Lee Hall, which is our School of Architecture. Um, when they dismantled those slave quarters to use them as foundation stones for some of our early buildings. We know Hardin Hall, probably Old Main or Tillman Hall, and some of the faculty houses that went up really early. The footprints of those slave quarters were still visible in the late 1930s. And the professor who founded our architecture program, Rudolph Lee, knew about those footprints and wanted to preserve them. He wanted to create what he called a little Williamsburg on campus, where he would have historic houses, plantation outbuildings, and those footprints of the slave quarters was going to be a part of that little Williamsburg that he created for Clemson. He actually drew up plans. We've seen his architectural plans. He, coordinated with local folks. Woodburn Plantation was going to be a part of it, Ashtabula. It was going to be quite a site. But once again, that recommendation was put forth, but it was not accepted. So we're not sure what happened to those stones. Joe McGill came to campus a few years ago, and we slept in Lee Hall as close as we could to that site. I was recently told was told first and then saw an aerial shot of campus where you could see the footprint of the slave quarters on the map. So we're trying to get the precise location using that photograph. But we think that the stones, those foundation stones, were probably removed as the campus expanded, is what we think happened. So why did it take so long? That's a really good question. I don't know. That's something as coordinator, I didn't say that when I introduced myself. I am the coordinator of research and community engagement for the Woodland Cemetery Preservation Project. And that's a question that I asked, especially when I saw the stewardship report that was issued in 2005. And it had clearly marked on this report that smaller 1-acre site, as well as the larger West Side area, where it was no secret that people believed African Americans were buried on Cemetery Hill. And then additionally, when they found the remains of those children in the 1960s, that was evidence that African Americans were continuing to bury their dead on Cemetery Hill or Woodland Cemetery well into the 20th century. So why was there resistance to acknowledging that site, putting up a sign, hiring people to do the work? I was asked by a former administrator what would I have done in the 21st century on that last big initiative differently. And I said, well, I would have reached out to the foremost expert on African American burial grounds in the country and had a consultation with him. That person at that time was Dr. Michael Blakey. He was working on the African burial ground in New York City. And I wonder if Clemson had reached out to him at that time, if this story would have been different. But the story didn't start in the 21st century, as I just illustrated. It was known, early in the existence of the college's existence that those burials were there. So the resistance came not from the faculty and staff, but it came from the administrators It came from the president, it came from the trustees, despite the continual efforts of faculty and staff to ensure that that history was preserved. So we're trying to figure out why there was resistance. We have seen that even though Clemson started as an integrated community, by the 1930s, there were efforts to begin moving African Americans off campus, first to areas kind of on the sides of campus and then eventually off campus completely. But that still does not help me to understand why a burial ground, right? That everybody in a burial ground should be honored and respected. Why was there resistance to do that is a question that we're still trying to answer. So do I think the narrative of Clemson is beginning to change in terms of the real and complete history of the campus? I do. I actually do. I think that this cemetery project in particular is beginning to change things pretty significantly. One of the things that happened in the cemetery that we're dealing with right now is that Clemson used to allow people to park and tailgate in the cemetery on football game days. So when the fans came back for our regular season this year, they were very surprised that all of a sudden parking and tailgating was no longer allowed in the cemetery. And as we were preparing some educational materials for the fans this week, and I was talking with the gentleman who broadcasts the football games, I said to him, I said, Clemson allowed this. They allowed the parking, they allowed the tailgating for years. We have photos that go back for years and years and years where you can see pictures of cars parked in the cemetery. We have many, many people who've told me that they tailgated in the cemetery. So we're doing a pretty dramatic shift. It's a 180, right? From allowing lots of things in the cemetery to saying no motorized vehicles, no skateboards, to please be respectful. There are unmarked graves that are under the paths that go around the cemetery. So we place some barriers over there to try and protect them. Right now it's like it's homecoming weekend. And so we had a massive effort to get the word out so that as thousands of people are coming to campus, that they will know that there's a significant change in the way the university is allowing access. We still want people to visit the cemetery. Part of our team will be there tomorrow to provide information about the cemetery. But my position is everyone who's buried in that cemetery deserves to be respected, deserves to be memorialized. We are creating stories as much as we can for groups of people, our individuals, as we learn their stories. We just want to make sure that the cemetery is honored. It's sacred space for me, and we want the public to acknowledge and treat it as sacred space. So I've got some questions over here in the chat. I'm trying to scroll down a little. So someone asked if I was getting any pushback on my work. I would say not necessarily pushback, but more when I first started the work that I was doing, I went to the administrator, went to the president, actually. I talk about this in my book. And I just simply asked for a public endorsement that it seemed to me that Clemson's story was incomplete, and I wanted the university to reach out and say, hey, we're going to take a look, right? And whatever we find, we're going to share. And I was sent a message. I didn't even get a chance to talk directly to then President Jim Barker. And he told me I could do whatever I wanted, but Clemson wasn't interested in endorsing a study of that nature at the time. So no pushback, but no support. So I don't know if you want to call no support pushback. I was untenured. I was assistant professor. My department was concerned that I was getting involved in a history project when I'm an English professor. So I had to do both. I had to write my book for tenure, and then I'm doing this work on the side because I couldn't stay at Clemson and not try to recover this history. I, I didn't have any money. I was doing a lot of this on my own time. And then I met Dr. Bostic right around the time I recovered those convict records in the state archive. He heard about my work. He gave me some money and asked the university to match his donation. So I went from having $0 to $100,000. And then I went from having $100,000. They doubled that money when they saw all the work that I was doing. So from nothing to, $200,000 within a couple of years. This was like 2015, 2016 was pretty incredible. So that's when the project really took off. So initially, no support, a change of administration. We got our new president, who we have now, who is very supportive of my work. I had a very, very good friend who was well connected and influential step in and ask the university to support me. So from that point on, things changed. I always had the support of my department, always had the support of my college, but the university support was the last thing that happened. I did have students tell me I was trying to tear down the school, that I should leave the painful things in the past, that Clemson was a great place and I should just not bring up those things that just hurt people. My answer was that I'm a South Carolinian. The history of the state is written on my skin. I'm a descendant of enslaved people and enslavers. So for me, this is not in the past. I look at it, I see it in the mirror every day. I see that history written literally on my body. So it's not something that I can forget. So I persevered and went on. So another question was, does the work of the burial ground in Clemson ever interact with projects on reparations for descendants of those African Americans at the cemetery? So that's a question that we are working through. Reparations, I would say that we haven't had a direct discussion about possible reparations, but some of the things that have come out of the Legacy Council is that one of the things I've been asked to do is, as a land grant institution, the things that Clemson creates out of our research, very, very aggressive research agenda, those resources are to be made available to the state. So I have been asked to make sure we are identifying needs of local African American communities and making sure any resources that the university has, we are making available to the public. So we've done everything from, we have a entrepreneurship workshop coming up. We do beautification projects. We are participating in a mentoring program for elementary school children. We are collaborating with local cultural and arts organizations that focus on Black history and providing support for them. Those are just some things off the top of my head. The trustees are very interested in starting and providing more scholarship funds and financing for African American students, which continues to be a major impediment for their coming to Clemson and staying at Clemson. Sometimes they come, but then they run out of money. So there is a renewed commitment to raise more funds to provide money, scholarships, grants for students to come. So, all of those things for me fall under redress, restorative justice. And so we are hoping that this project will lead to more opportunities for us to ensure that the descendants, I would like to see not just the enslaved, the descendants of the enslaved, but also of the sharecroppers and of the convicted laborers be included in those conversations about who should be provided or who should be benefited by any initiatives that deal with restorative justice. Any other questions? Have I worked with Dr. Henry Louis Gates? I would like to work with Dr. Gates. I have been told that I should tell my own family story to Dr. Gates, who does those roots kind of programs. What I didn't tell you all is that as I have been doing this research, I talked about my ancestry of being a descendant of both enslavers and enslaved people. One of the things that I discovered, my great great grandmother, Lucretia Earl, I grew up hearing lots of stories about her. She raised my grandmother. She was born enslaved, moved to Columbia, South Carolina area after emancipation. And I didn't know her last name. I didn't know her birth name, rather. I knew her as Lucretia Earl, my dad's family name. And so I found out her birth name was Wanamaker. I thought that was an interesting name. I had heard the Wanamaker name from the grocery store chain up in Philadelphia, but I didn't know any Wanamakers in South Carolina. So I just made a little note on my family tree and went about my business. One day I was doing some reading and some notes one of my research assistants had made for me, and I saw the name Wanamaker connected with Clemson. And I was like, oh boy, that's interesting. So I did a little digging and had done some DNA testing and found that my family, through my great great grandmother, Lucretia Wanamaker Earl, um, was owned by John Wanamaker's big extended family. There were several brothers who were slaveholders over in the Calhoun County area. Lucretia was described as being very, very light skinned with long straight hair. And when I put pictures of her and John Wanamaker side by side, they have the same body type. If you were to add me and my daddy to those pictures of my grandmother, all five of us have the same body type. So those genes are pretty strong. So we've done some preliminary research, genealogy research, and been able to trace back to the Wanamaker family. We need to do like the second wave of that and find out which of the brothers was my great great grandmother's um, um, father. But, we've been able to pinpoint the family and pinpoint the area and pinpoint some possibilities. So that's what happens when you do research like this. I became part of Clemson's narrative. There's a building on campus named Wanamaker Hall. I've gone over and taken pictures in front of it. It's a little weird, frankly, still, when I think about how my own family story got connected to Clemson's family story. They call it the Clemson family. Trustee Wanamaker was the longest living of the first 7 trustees, died about 1930. So, when people say, why do you do this? And I'm like, well, I'm part of the story. I can say that now. Can folks make donations to my project? Thank you so much, Shelley Murphy, for asking that question. Yes, if you go to the Clemson Foundation website or to my website, callmyname.org, that might be easier. If you just go to callmyname.org, there is a donation button that you can push, and it takes you to the Clemson Foundation, and you can make a contribution directly to Call My Name through the Clemson Foundation. So thank you for asking that. I'm aware of a lot of cemetery restoration work that's gone on in Germany. Often the cemetery work is a gateway to other work. I get a similar sense from your work. Can you talk about what it is about cemetery work and burial work that makes it such a powerful place to start, or a powerful gateway? I think, death is an equalizer. We're all going to die. I think that what I'm finding is, I was talking with a man who was doing some work on the cemetery for us this morning, and he said, everybody in the cemetery deserves to be honored. He's like, I don't care if they're in a marked grave or an unmarked grave, everybody deserves to be honored. So what I am getting is that it's kind of this place where we all come together and we say, we need to honor the dead. It doesn't matter who they are. We need to honor the dead. We don't care if we know their names or don't know their names. We need to honor the dead. So I think because it pulls everybody to the table to be respectful of the dead, then it opens up these conversations. You start talking about your families, you start talking about your communities, you start talking about what people need and what they have. And as we have been working with the local community and getting to know them, as we are trying to stitch the story back together, it seems to be a natural outgrowth of the work, even though the trustees asked me to do it. It also has come kind of organically out of just getting to know people and saying, oh yeah, Clemson could help with that. And I often hear myself saying that as I've gotten to know more about the resources that the university has and our land grant mission, I have been able to say, oh, let me check and see what we can do, or let us connect you with an organization in the community. But it started with us both saying we need to care about all the graves. We need to care about all the people who are buried here. So I think that mutual decision to respect the dead kind of puts you on an equal plane. And from that grows this desire to be caring about the living, is the way I would answer that question. Were there any other questions, or did I miss anybody? So the question was, are African American staff and faculty allowed to be buried in the white cemetery? So because there are so many unmarked burials, the trustees are now deciding who will be buried in the cemetery. So technically, any employee of Clemson can be buried in the cemetery if you work for the university for more than 20 years. That's the current policy. To date, there are no people of color buried in the marked graves. So I don't know what's going to happen moving forward. We're still waiting for the trustees to make a decision. But at this point, anyone who works for Clemson for more than 20 years is eligible to be buried in Woodland Cemetery. But all of that is contingent on the new policies that will be created. Am I funded by the university? So yes, my dean of my college just secured some funding for the play that I'm writing. We also are funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. We've gotten about $600,000 worth of grants, or maybe about $500,000 worth of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I was a Whiting Fellow. Dr. Bostic has continued to support my project. The Office of the Provost has been very generous in supporting my project. So yes, Clemson has heavily invested in Call My Name, and I'm very grateful for that. Our Division of Inclusion and Equity has also gotten very involved with supporting Call My Name. So I am pleased with the level of support that Call My Name is receiving from Clemson. And they see the value in what I'm doing. My provost says you're research oriented. I said, yes, I'm very stickler for details and, documenting. I said, but on the other hand, I also will accept oral history. I said, I believe in multiple ways to tell stories. And oral history means as much to me as a historical document. So we try to mine all opportunities and options to tell these stories. I have thousands of names now, and my goal is for every person who has been identified as an African American in Clemson history gets a story. Even if that's 0-year-old Katie on that schedule of slaves, and all I can say about her is that she was the baby girl in this family of 7, 3 siblings, a mama and a daddy, and she appeared on this list in 1854. That's more than just saying 0-year-old Katie. And to talk about her as a baby, right? She's a baby who is being treated as a piece of property in the sale of this plantation. So we believe in storytelling, and we believe that every person, in the same way that they deserve respect in the cemetery, that every person is a human being who deserves to have a story, who deserves to have a biography, who deserves to have their humanity affirmed and honored. So that's the work of Call My Name. And I think it's important, to affirm life as well as death. So burial grounds as a whole need to be honored, because if this was Arlington Cemetery, yeah, I hear you, Gabriel. If it was, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So it looks like we have like 1 minute. Are there any quick last questions? Thank you all. I love the chat. So many wonderful, thank you for every comment that you made about my work and the presentation. Appreciate you all supporting. Thank you, Joe, for stopping by the presentation. But it's been an honor to be here and spend this time with you. And thank you very much. So Joe has one last question here. How is the overall effort for all institutions? I would say look to University Studying Slavery Consortium. There are universities all over the world who are coming together to change the narrative, and it's often through the lens of the history and legacies of slavery and enslavement of Black and Brown people who helped to build and sustain campuses. So when you pull that narrative in, the whitewash narrative of white founders, often who are slaveholders, Confederates, white supremacists, is blown out of the water and shown to be misleading and incorrect. So I think we're out of time. So thank you all. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. This was awesome. And to our audience, she taught me a whole lot I did not know, and I'm sure you learned a whole lot as well. Thank you so much. And I will be visiting your website. Hope everybody else will take the time to look you up and enjoy some more sessions today at the conference. To our listening audience, God bless.
Thank you so much. Take care.